All right, ladies and gentlemen, I'm here with Matt Bartley Seigel. Matt, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I appreciate it.
It's really a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess we'll jump right into it here and start off by letting everybody know you're not technically a Youper. You weren't born here. You're a trooper, as they say. But why don't you tell everybody where it is that you're from?
So I grew up down in Montcalm County, which is dead center of the Mitten, about 55 miles northeast of Grand Rapids, due north of Lansing, a little south of Mount Pleasant, where you went to school.
Yeah, absolutely. What was it like growing up for you there? I always like to ask kind of people that to get a feel for life, whether it be in the UP or out of the UP. I'm always curious what that was like for you.
Yeah, well, Montcalm County exists in a weird part of the downstate where it's sort of the line between the sort of industrial agrarian southern part of the Mitten and then the more kind of resource extractive agrarian upper part of the Mitten. And it's consistently in the running for poorest per capita county in the state. It's usually in the running with like Baraga or Ontonagon County. It's super rural. It certainly was when I was growing up there. Although in the last couple of decades, it's become something of a bedroom community for the kind of greater Grand Rapids area. But my folks lived on a spread near a little town called Coral, a location called Coral, Five Corners. Our nearest neighbor was, about a mile and a half away, and most of our neighbors were Amish, um, and it was very backcountry for
Sure.
downstate. So very reminiscent of lots of the places I've spent the last 25, 30 years of my life up here.
Absolutely. I feel like small town life, no matter whether what part of the state it is or even just the Midwest in general, small town life has very similar styles or views,
It
so to
does.
speak.
I got a really good friend from graduate school. He lives in a place called Travelers Rest down in South Carolina, up in the hill country, and we like to compare hillbilly stories.
Now, you got your bachelor's degree from Eastern Michigan University in
Yeah.
journalism. What led you to Eastern? I mean, you mentioned Central. You're pretty close right there. What kind of led you a little further down the road?
I banged around a little bit as a young man. I didn't know what I wanted to do. I was um, I was first generation college student. My dad was a tool and die maker, and my mom was a kind of a jack of all trades homemaker. Um, and I had no. My high school counselor thought that probably the military was my best option, and I'm sure I had a couple of teachers in high school that thought prison was the next the next best one. And so when I my folks were really vocationally focused, and when I went away to school, they were super interested in me having a career when I came out. And so I actually came up to Michigan Tech, and I spent 1 year as a student at Tech. Started out in forestry and kind of moved sort of out of the hard sciences, and I ended up taking a creative writing class with a professor by the name of Randy Freisinger, who was one of the long list candidates for this year's UP Poet Laureate. And Randy it liked my writing and was encouraging me to pursue it, and thus also kind of encouraged me to leave Michigan Tech because it was a much harder STEM school, hard STEM, not a harder institution, but more kind of focused on hard STEM at that time in the early '90s than it is now, where we have sort of more robust humanities and social sciences than
Sure.
we need to. And so I ended up down at Eastern. I left tech, and I was dating a woman who was from Houghton, who became my wife, and she was at the University of Michigan. And I couldn't go into English; that wasn't vocational enough. And Eastern had a journalism degree, and that made my dad happy because he thought I'd come out of college with a job. So that's how I ended up at Eastern Michigan.
Okay,
Lived
fair
in Ann
fair enough.
Arbor and ended up in Eastern Michigan.
You mentioned, this creative writing course that you took at Tech, but did you kind of enjoy writing from a younger age, or did you really kind of find that knack in college and as you got older?
I think storytelling has always been a big part of my sort of personal experience. And my parents, they had just high school diplomas under their belt. They were really kind of self-educated intellectuals. They were always reading, and I was always reading as a result. And I loved stories and storytelling and film and movies and television and listening to other people's stories. And we always had a lot of really good storytellers in my family. And I was always a damn good liar. That was when I was a kid, probably too good for my own good. And so that was always, I feel like looking back, I mean, to the extent that we can look back into our deep origins and see it for what it was, I feel like that was always kind of a part and parcel of me. But it wasn't until I got into high school where I started dabbling with creative writing. And then that was something that was just sort of with me throughout my 20s. Um, and it wasn't until I was out of school and I was working for a paper. I got a job in journalism working for a paper called the Center Daily Times, which is out in State College, Pennsylvania,
Mm-hmm.
where Penn State is. And I spent some time working as a beat reporter. And I just was kind of continually drawn back to the more kind of creative, lyric side of writing. And of course, in journalism, that's a no-no. So, or it's supposed to be.
Right.
It's supposed to
Yes.
be a no-no.
Supposed to be. Yeah.
And so I went back to graduate school. I went to Penn State, and I pursued my MFA in creative writing at Penn State.
Okay. That was going to be kind of my next question, was how you end up from Eastern all the way out to Penn State, but with the job that you picked up as a beat writer out there, everything kind of then you lined it up for me. You kind of, I think you knew where I was headed with it.
I was always, from the time I was about 21, I was always following a woman. I was, my wife, my wife was a student at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, and I followed her from Houghton down to there. And then she was a grad student at Penn State first, and I followed her out to Penn State, and she got the tenure track gig at she got a professorship at Michigan Tech, and we'd had our first kid, and she wanted to come back up and be with family. And I still had a lot of connections in the area, and we moved back up to Houghton in 2005. And we've
Awesome.
been here full time since then, off and
So
on over the years. But yeah, I always tell people, I don't have an agenda. I'm just following my wife around.
perfect. Whatever works, right? So I mean, I know you went to school at Tech, and then you left, and then you're back up there. But I mean, how do you compare that to your life in Montcalm County compared to like the UP, as far as like, your first big like weather season with like the snow? I mean, was there any like not culture shock, because I mean it's still pretty rural, I guess, up in Houghton, or can be, but was there any kind of like knee jerk reaction?
No, yeah, I mean, we were outdoors people
Okay.
uh, growing up, and I was a loner kid. I spent most of my time in the woods and doing one thing or the other. And so when I was in high school, you know, there wasn't anything I wanted to do more than backpack and camp and fish, and I had all kinds of romantic notions of being out on the land, and so you know, being in the UP in many ways was just an opportunity to kind of turn up the dial a little bit on something that I you know, kind of grew up being immersed in and amongst. And certainly the folks of the UP are feel very much at home to me. I mean, growing up in Montcalm County, I grew up around working class rural people and lots of agrarian folks, and of course lots of Chippewa,
Yeah.
Anishinaabe folks, and so being up here is always to me felt very much like home.
I like that. I like the comparison that you made of kind of turning up the dial on a lot of the stuff that you were already used to. That I like that a
Yeah.
lot.
I mean, I won't lie to you. I mean, anybody that comes up to the copper country and spends their first winter behind a Yooper scoop is going to learn a few things about their lower back
Yes. Yeah,
that
that's
that maybe they didn't know prior. But you know, I've spent more than a few winters in cold, gray, muddy, icy places, and I'll take a UP winter any day
absolutely.
over some of what the rest of the Midwest deals with in the wintertime. And we're skiers and snowshoers, and we're outside 365 days a year. So
Yeah. So, okay, so your official title at Michigan Tech is you're the associate professor of creative writing and literature, correct?
yep,
Okay,
correct.
so what all does that really entail? Like how many classes do you have to teach, or what really goes into that position?
Yeah, I'm a professor at Tech. I teach creative writing and literature classes. I've usually got two, maybe three classes a semester. Um, they're usually split between uh, some type of creative writing or composition course. I teach a lot of editing courses. I have a lot of background in literary editing, and so I teach a lot of courses in that, and then I teach a smattering of contemporary or emerging American literature
Okay.
classes, and then I'm also the director of the Multi-Literacy Center, which is Tech's writing center. That
Yeah, I that was going to be my kind of next question was about
Yeah,
that multi-literacy center. So it's really just kind of a like a writing center.
the writing center. Yeah, I mean, multi-literacies is just kind of a big fancy word to sort of include all of the different types of writing and storytelling that people engage in, and to try and you break down this notion that there's sort of one particular way to tell a story, and there
Sure.
are multitudinous ways of doing that, and so it's kind of a fancy way of getting at that idea.
You had mentioned earlier that tech in the early 90s was a lot more heavily STEM focused, and obviously that's kind of transitioned, as you're mentioning with the multi-literacy center and having a little more robust program. Is that something that was already kind of in the works before you were even there, or is that something that's kind of
Oh
gradually
yeah,
picked up?
I couldn't even be. I wish I could take credit for any of it, but that all preceded me. And there's you know, starting back in the late '70s and on through the '80s and into the mid '90s, there was just a you know, sort of a massive expansion in arts and humanities, social sciences, sort of non-STEM STEM fields at Michigan Tech. And as Tech sort of blossomed into a Research One university, even though we're still relatively small, we kind of have a little bit of everything for everybody. And we still are very much a technological university. I mean, that's really, you know, even in my neck of the campus, there's a sort of a strong emphasis on sort of thinking in that frame, and that's what we do. But it's a cool place to work. I really like it a lot.
I can imagine. I mean, for me, I grew up in the UP my entire life here. When I think Michigan Tech, I think of math and science.
Yeah, oh
And I
sure.
think, and I think most people do.
Yep,
So, to
absolutely.
talking about creative writing and that type of stuff. It's not really something you would normally associate with Michigan Tech. So I
Yeah.
think that's really cool.
Who is it more important to have writing well than our scientists and our engineers?
Yes.
They have big responsibilities on their shoulders, and if they're not communicating well, boy, we're all in trouble. We live in a world where we see the ramifications of poor communication all the time. So
Amen to that. Yeah, amen to that. So you mentioned that you kind of got back up to tech in a teaching role around
yeah,
2005. I know that
yep,
you co-founded Pank magazine in 2006. Can
yep.
you walk listeners through a little bit what exactly Pank is and how that all came together?
Sure. So it's a I always feel a little strange talking about this because I feel like for the vast majority of people it's a super esoteric and strange cultural space. But Pank was a literary magazine. We published poetry, short fiction, and some short lyric nonfiction, all literary forms. Um, Within the very rarefied frame of literary magazines, it had some success and was certainly kind of where I made my mark on the national um, scene. And I was fortunate enough to have a co-editor by the name of Roxane Gay, who some of your listeners may be familiar with. She's certainly not hard to find if you're not familiar with Roxane. And she came on board, and the magazine really took off. As a literary, tech has never sort of historically had literary magazines. It's just not within that wheelhouse
Yeah.
of science, technology, engineering, and math. And I when I was first up at Tech, they had a little defunct undergrad magazine that they kind of threw in my lap and told me to do something with it. And I asked if there was strings attached, and they said no. And I asked if there was money attached, and they said yes. And then I met Roxane, and kind of the rest is history.
Very cool. So I gotta ask then, why Pank? Why name it Pank?
so I'm guessing at least some of your listeners will be familiar with the word pank.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, which of course in the idiom of the Upper Peninsula is the verb that we use to describe the process of packing down snow when we don't want to shovel it. We pank it down. But it was also a term used in the mines up here to describe the process of tamping dynamite into blast holes. You
Oh,
want to
okay.
just pank it in. You hit it a little too hard and you're in trouble. And of course, if you don't hit it hard enough, it doesn't go in the blast hole. And we really loved the metaphor of that for a literary magazine. It was actually an undergrad student. Her name at the time was Megan Collier. I believe her married name, or Hess, Megan Hess. Her name now, her married name is Megan Collier. I believe she lives in the Sioux. She came up with the name Pank out of the blue. She was a born and bred Youper, and she came up with that. And we user tested the term. I had writer friends and people in publishing all over the country, and as we were kind of thinking about the name Pank and we were shopping it around, of course, once you get outside of the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, maybe some parts of northern Wisconsin, and there's actually a little pocket of northwestern Pennsylvania where the word pops up. Once you get outside of these mining areas, nobody had a clue what the word meant, and that ambiguity really kind of worked in our favor. It really set us apart.
Yeah, I love it. And you kind of touched on what I was going to mention of it being a very regional, like Youper
Yep.
word. Um, the second episode that I ever did of this podcast was with Dr. Will Rankinen, and he's a
Yeah.
sociolinguist
Yep.
from the UP, but does primarily, I think he's out of Grand Valley, and he and I had a long discussion about the word pank and a lot of other words that are really,
Great word.
yeah,
Yep.
absolutely. So
No word has ever treated me so well as the word pank.
yeah. Now, you released your first book of poems in 2013 called This Is
Yeah,
What They Say. Correct? That's the name of it. This is
correct.
what they
Yep.
say. Okay. Um, Based on what I was able to get a few glimpses of a few of the poems and what's in there, um, it's really kind of dedicated to the people and places where you grew up. Am
Yep.
I kind of understanding that
Yep.
correctly?
Yeah, it's
Okay.
very much written out of the experience of growing up in Montcalm County.
Yeah. Now, I mean, you mentioned earlier that you were, kind of a loner at times, and you mentioned, kind of living kind of out in a rural setting. From what I gathered, it wasn't, at least in your younger years, always the fondest view of where you grew up. Is that fair?
I'll call it an honest view
Okay.
of where of where I grew up. I mean, in the work is, one of the things I've always been really interested in as a poet, and interested in poetry, is poetry's ability to sort of focus the attention on parts of life that we either don't have an opportunity to spend a lot of time with. That's why we see so many poems about death, or parts of life that we really want to celebrate. That's why we've seen so many poems about love and marriage, or to focus on parts of life that we just don't want to look at all. And growing up in a place like the UP, growing up in a place like Montcalm County, um, the narratives that you receive as a kid growing up, um, they oftentimes don't match what you actually see out your bedroom window. And you see a lot of ruin, and you see a lot of poverty, and you see a lot of despair, and those aren't super fun things to spend a lot of time on. And so in that book, I was really trying to come to terms with, how do you find hope in a place that, in some ways might seem kind of hopeless, or out of situations in life that might seem kind of hopeless. And so a lot of the poems in that book, I mean, they deal with substance abuse and addiction, and physical abuse, and isolation, and mobility, particularly, feeling maybe like you don't have a lot of it.
Absolutely. And
Uh,
I think you hit the nail on the head, whether it's downstate or the UP. I think with that small town feeling of isolation and feeling kind of trapped in a lot of ways. I think it correlates, no matter where you're at.
Yeah, well, and really growing up hardworking class, and again, being of a mind to kind of think critically about these sort of mythological structures that we find ourselves living in. One of the things that always really bothered me was the way in which working class people were talked about, and that it either sort of uh, turned into a cartoon, for the consumption of people in more cosmopolitan environments, or condescended to, right? We're all hillbillies, we're all hayseeds, we're all
Yeah,
hicks. Um, um, and and wanting to, in some way, kind of talk back to that, and talk to the richness of life in a place like Lakeview, Michigan, or Coral, Michigan, in the communities where I grew up, or in places like Centennial Heights, or Amique, or Trinary, up here in the Copper Country. That, these places aren't cartoons, and the people who live in these places, they're not cartoon characters. They're real people, and they have rich, robust, um, literary worthy lives, and I really like sort of speaking to that depth.
absolutely. And part of the few pieces from the book that I read, my kind of takeaway, what I kind of like kept going back to with my internal, not struggle, but what I think a lot of people from the UP that are similar to me go through is, in your younger years, as you feel that angst of being a teenager and such, and you dream of more, getting out of that small
Gotta get
town,
out.
right? You got to get out, and you're just like, okay, when I finish school, I'm going to get out and see the world. And then you do, and it's not quite what you
That
planned,
we
because
thought.
yeah, life happens when you're busy making plans.
Yep.
and and then so many people like myself, you end up getting drawn back into that small town, but now you're maybe a little older, a little wiser, and
Yep.
you kind of have them now an appreciation for that small town life.
Yep.
Things move a little slower. It's an interesting kind of conundrum that I found myself kind of pondering over.
Yep. Amen.
So what is it that really inspires you to write? I mean, is it just
Hmm.
what you see around you? Is it family? I mean, what do you really draw that inspiration from to write your poetry?
That's a tough one. Um, I'm not a fantastically prolific writer by any stretch of the imagination. I am slow and methodical um, in my work, and so I it tends the inspiration for my work tends to sort of exist the inspiration exists in a kind of multiplicity of ways across time. So usually I in initial versions of work, I'm really responding to some immediate um, stimulus or emotion or situation that I find myself in. And then as I work through poems and I work through the drafting process, things become increasingly formal. So I'm a poet who's very much interested in vocabulary and syntax and line and meter and prosody. Um, and I'm a tinkerer, and I want, my poems are in the vein of like William Carlos Williams' Little Machines. I'm a tinkerer with language, and through the tinkering, the poem starts to very quickly sort of leave the bounds of reality and become kind of increasingly sort of fictionalized or mythologized. And then at that point, I'm usually in a position where kind of thinking about, well, what is it that I want this thing that I'm now holding in my hands to do? And that becomes sort of an additional layer of constraint to the poem. And that process has really sort of evolved organically over the years. I think mostly just because I'm such a slow plodding writer.
Fair enough. Uh, I'm that was going to kind of be my next question for you, because I myself am a writer, or not that I publish anything. I mean, I do have a children's book that I published, but I write on my own, and I'm constantly going back and rewriting and redoing things, and revising and all of that good stuff. And my question was going to be if it works the same with poetry, if you're going back and changing things, or are you just, this is what I feel in that moment and I'm going to let it live as what I'm feeling, was really going to be my question.
It's the full gamut. I mean, anytime I get drawn into a conversation about poetic process and craft, the 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 reductive wisdom that I always feel compelled to give is that, like, the process and craft of any individual poet is as unique as that individual.
Sure.
And any kind of externally imposed metric on how you create or what you create or how often you create is sort of somebody else's ideal, which may or may not have any bearing on you as an artist. um uh you know I write the way that I write because, going back to your previous question, on the one hand, I can't not write. It's a compulsion. It's I've always been drawn to language, even since I was a little kid. And I'm the type of person who, like, you and I meet on the street and I'm awkward and I can't get the words out of my mouth, and so I go home and I obsess about this interaction that I had with you for
Yes.
a week, and then I get to write out how I wish things had gone. and how I write out what I wish I could say in that situation where I am more kind of articulate person on the spot, and so much of my own process kind of comes out of that.
Absolutely. I can relate to that very, very much. um, as far as poets, what type of poetry or poets are you drawn towards that you like to read?
Oh boy, I love I'm a classic poetry nerd. I'm always kind of amazed. I mean, here we are in the United States of America. Ours is not a I mean, you get into a taxi cab, I'm generalizing, but like you get into a taxi cab in Santiago in Chile, or you get into a cab in Ghana. Like those are cultures that are very language centric and literary, and people love poetry and they love to talk about poetry. And in the United States, not so much. I mean,
No.
you know, coming from a hard working class background, I still, like, when people ask me what I do, I have this scared little moment where I'm like, am I really going to tell them I'm a poet? Like, is that an okay thing for me to say? Um, so so it's hard. It's hard here. You have to own it in weird ways.
I, to be honest with you though, I mean, I can't think of any other way to handle it besides just owning it. I
You just
mean,
gotta own it. But that said, I'm a classic poetry nerd, so I'm kind of always amazed that poetry exists at all. Anytime I encounter poetry in the United States, I'm always sort of like, wow, that's amazing that exists. And poetry is such an organically Adamic literature for the human animal. I mean, our language, our spoken language in particular, is just naturally conducive to verse, and so poetry is the language of mothers singing to babies, and it's the language of fathers lullabying their children to sleep, and it's the language of mass marketing and communication, and we tweet in poetic forms and we post on Facebook in poetic forms. And so in some ways I'm the type of person that just when I wake up and I look out on the world, what I see is poetry. But that said, I'm also really drawn to like uh, really crafted, uh, uh, hard to categorize poetics. I love the work of Harriet Mullen. I love the work of Audre Lorde. Um, uh, I like a lot. I still am passionate about Gertrude Stein, but I'm super passionate about getting to know like Tyler Detloff's work, who's one of my shortlisters, who I'm just kind of learning about through the UP Poet Laureate experience. I get a poem a day from the Poetry Foundation every morning in my inbox, and I look forward to that sort of without fail. So in some ways I'm a bad person to ask, like, what kind of poetry do you like to read? Because I'm the guy who's reading the back of a cereal box and I'm like, but this is poetry. This too is a
fair,
poem.
fair enough, fair enough. But I guess at the very least, it's interesting to get at least your perspective on that then, because not everybody looks at the world through that lens, obviously. So
I've always got a notebook in my pocket, and I'm eavesdropping on things that people are saying, and I'm jotting down little turns of phrase or weird vocabulary that people are using, and I'm sponging that for inspiration all the
uh,
time.
a little bit ago, you mentioned in the course of your writing process that you tinker with words almost like they're like little machines. Can you talk a little bit about one of your newer projects called Simple Machines that you have going on?
Yeah, so back in 2015, Um, Roxanne was moving out to the West Coast to pursue bigger and better projects, and I was having a hard time imagining doing Pink Magazine without her. And so we sold that property, and I got out of literary magazine editing for the last 5 years. And I did some editing. I did some review editing for a place called Words Without Borders for a while, and I really enjoyed that, working with like literature and translation and poets and writers working outside of the sort of the American English bell jar. But I missed it. I missed literary editing. I missed the creative aspect of bringing something just really tactile and artifactual into the world. But more importantly, I really, really missed providing a platform for younger or more emerging poets, or poets who were maybe working in a form or with a topic that wasn't going to go easily into the Beloit Poetry Review or into Plowshares. I loved providing a platform for that kind of work, and I missed that. And I missed there being a literary magazine at Michigan Tech. And so a group of colleagues and I sort of hatched this idea for a new literary magazine. It's called Simple Machines. It's a letterpress, poetry letterpress. We are currently accepting submissions for our very first issue, which will be out at some point this spring. We are employing guest editors. So the way the magazine will work is that each guest editor that comes in will have an opportunity to kind of craft the aesthetic of the issue that they're editing for. They'll write the call for submissions. They'll help select the poets who we're going to publish. They'll collaborate in sort of figuring out what the artifact, what the actual physical magazine will look like. And then they'll invite or nominate a new guest editor who will be the next in line and come in, and we'll repeat that process with the idea that each iteration of Simple Machines will sort of be this brand new poetry magazine. First issue should be out sometime this spring, if the plague doesn't screw stuff up for us anymore, there's are more coups or whatever.
Yeah.
And then we'll probably put out two issues a year, and it's just really kind of a labor of love. And I love literary magazines. I've been dinking around with literary magazines since I was an undergrad in college, and I just have never lost the passion for them.
Well, and number one, it's a cool idea, but number two, you've got another cool name for a magazine at a technological university. I mean, that just goes hand in glove. I mean,
It does. Yeah, I did not have to work nearly as hard selling the idea of a literary magazine called Simple Machines as I did selling one called Pank. Even though the Pank is still like near and dear to me, it's the magazine still exists. It's out in the world, doing its thing.
Sure.
But Simple Machines is I think it's gonna find a good home at Michigan Tech.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've kind of touched or scratched the surface a couple of times about the UP Poet Laureate competition, which
Yep.
you are a finalist of this competition.
Yep.
Can you explain what exactly this competition is?
Ooh. Maybe.
Maybe.
So the man that you have to talk to if you want to learn all about the ins and outs of the UP Poet Laureate is Ron.
Yep.
Ron Reiki. And I can't give you off the top of my head, I really can't give you good firm dates. I think it's been about 5 years,
Okay.
6 years maybe, that the UP Poet Laureate has been in existence. Uh, there was at that time no state of Michigan poet laureate.
Okay.
I don't know off the top of my head if we have one now or not.
Okay.
I don't think we do, but your listeners will go and
Sure.
search the Google for that.
Is it something that like that you yourself enter yourself into, or do you get nominated?
No, no. So Ron kind of stepped into the breach and was like, "There's no Michigan poet laureate, but we're going to have a UP poet laureate because that's awesome."
Mm-hmm.
And so Ron sort of devised this whole mechanism for local libraries and English teachers, secondary school, university English teachers, literature folks, bookstore owners, and other sort of sundry literary provocateur personalities around the UP who could sort of nominate names. And then over the years, the selection process, I believe, has sort of taken slightly different forms. But this year, they compiled this committee that Ron runs compiled a list of 10 names, um, and we had a reading, and there was a voting um, process where people could kind of vote for their favorite poets from the UP, and that process between the reading and the committee and the voting winnowed it down to 5, and now apparently there's a sort of another committee that's being formed, and again, I believe it's made up of local librarians and, well, not local, but UP regional
Yeah.
librarians, bookstore owners, and folks working in literature programs at the universities who are working to kind of hone this list down. But it really is, I mean, it's and I say this because I think it's actually a really good thing. It's a little bit of a Wild West type of operation. Ron made something out of nothing, and for the intervening years, we've had these just really wonderful poets. Russell Thorburn was the first UP poet laureate, and then uh, why am of course I'm blanking on her name. I'll think of it in a second. And then Marty, who's been the poet laureate for the last couple years, and they've just done amazing things with the position and done just lots of education and outreach and really raised the profile of the poetry community in the Upper Peninsula and just really great ways.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I believe this competition, Ron had told me that I think it'll be decided mid-February. I think he said is when the final vote's gonna take place. But that
Yeah.
was gonna be my next question for you: is okay, so if you win this, what are like your duties, or what kind of goes into being like the winner of the UP Poet Laureate competition?
You know, all 3 of the preceding poet laureates have done sort of radically different things with the position. And I don't think there's really a set expectation for what a poet laureate does. And if you look around the country, if you look at, the poet laureate of Queens or the poet laureate of Indiana or the poet laureate of Seattle, or poet laureate of the United States, right? You see people doing a whole host of different things. I think were I to be graced with the crown of UP poet laureate, I really think my first action would be to organize readings around the UP to really bring to the attention of UPers the sort of wealth of the literary community that's in their midst, and not just at the local library or within the MFA program in Northern Michigan, which are kind of obvious
Mhm.
places, but to get into some of the corners of the UP where there's still a love and a passion for poetry and for literature, but that might not otherwise see someone like the poet laureate. And I'm not exactly sure how that would work. But the idea of highlighting UP poetry and spotlighting UP poets and bringing that to the people of the UP, um, I think would be a profoundly gratifying experience.
Yeah, I think that that's an awesome idea, and definitely something that's certainly a void that could be filled. Um, Early on in our conversation, you kind of mentioned that you've been kind of traipsing around the UP for what, almost 20 years, or maybe a little more than that now.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, it's been I'm pushing 30
oh, okay.
that I've been in some capacity kind of living, working, or bumming around the UP.
What do you enjoy most about the Upper Peninsula?
I can walk out my back door and not see anybody. That's what I enjoy the most. I, I, how much longer do you have for me to tell you the things that I love about this place, and that I find so powerful about this place? I mean, the landscape, yes. Living in the Keweenaw Peninsula, so close to some of the most ancient geology on the face of the planet, and within spitting distance of Lake Superior, which is just an absolutely I, it's a spiritual kind of experience to live on the shores of Lake Superior, and to live in such a rich kind of cultural community. To be really in the heart of Anishinaabe country, and to be able to sort of experience that culture, and to experience the richness of Anishinaabe-Moan, the Ojibwa language, and then the settler history of this area, the Finnish and the Cornish and the Irish and the Italian immigrants that came here and made this place their home on Ojibwa land, and then the way in which those cultures came together. I mean, it's just such a unique and fascinating confluence of flora and fauna and geography and hydrology and culture and peoples and languages, that you don't find in a physical environment like we have here too often, and it's just absolutely magical.
Absolutely. You might even say it's poetic.
It's a little poetic. I mean, you could write a poem about the UP if you wanted to, I suppose.
Matt, we've hit like all of the boxes that I checked them all off of stuff that I wanted to talk about. Is there anything you feel like I left out, or anything else you wanted to touch on, or just chat about with me?
Well, I could read a poem for your. I could
That
read
would
a
be
poem for your.
wonderful. In fact, I was going to actually ask you about that. If you have one there that you'd like to read, I would love for you to do that.
Well, I'll do two quick ones
Great.
that are both UP poems, and two of my favorites. I'll start with the sadder of the two, but we'll end with a love poem.
Okay.
Um, so this is a poem that appeared, I don't know, a year ago, 2 years ago, maybe, in a anthology called a Great Lakes Poetry Anthology, Waters Deep. And it's called Wave After Wave. Some of you will remember the November storm that we had in the fall of 2017. And this poem's kind of about that, amongst other things. Wave after wave. Dawn, a lit fuse. The radio man says bombogenesis, like agates tumbling from a jar. System as meteorite off Whitefish Point. In other words, water links, lathered up in red. In a heartbeat, rollers mass, 2 stories, trough to insatiate tempest, unquelled by prayer nor cigarette, careless, mean, a cold-blooded indifference so pure a strong swimmer won't last 10 wet minutes. At the Keweenaw, surf pummels the stamp sand with ochre fists. Oarboats stack up lee of the stone, and entire beaches stand up to walk away. At Marquette, 2 lovers walk onto black rocks, sacrificial lambs, their bodies will never be recovered.
It was
That's
beautiful.
wave after wave. Thank you. I went out. I was actually teaching. I was teaching a poetry workshop to graduate students, and on my way into class, I had the radio on, and I heard the weather report, and I told my students I have to end class early because I want to drive out to a place called Red Ridge in the Keweenaw. I want to watch the mass come in and watch the waves come in. And it was really, if you've ever seen a storm like that blow in off Lake Superior, it's really a pretty terrifying and awe-inspiring experience. And then when I was done sort of watching this natural show, I got back in the car and turned the radio back on, and I heard about those two poor folks in Marquette, and that poem followed shortly thereafter. Do you have time for one more?
Absolutely, I do. Yes, please, one more.
Then I'm going to end with a sauna poem.
Yeah, okay.
And also a love poem for my wife. This one appeared in a 2018 issue of Thrush Poetry Journal. It's called Birch Oil, Smoke, Pine Tar, Switch.
This is the one I was hoping you were going to read.
Oh, good.
It was of your stuff, this is my favorite. So
thank you very much. Mine too. It's one of my favorites. Birch oil, smoke, pine tar, switch. Sweat beads above her trapezius scar, coalescing to rivulet down her torso, past the mole I've claimed my own, stone amid the gathering rush. She reaches for the pine bucket of water, Mother Superior in her dipping spoon, then quick wrist flick at the rocks atop the stove, white hiss of steam mushrooming, rising up to the low ceiling before circling round, settling like nettles along the low bench. Cedar walled, lost in cloud bank, each of us a gathering wordless storm, we dewdrop and breach in long arcing inhalations of lung and heart, time and memory. Slow now. Patience, stamina, suffering, charge. Another time, shore and sauna, she slipped on wet tile and fell atop a wood stove. Searing metal, branding deep into her a burn so bad it did not even hurt, leaving her the scar shaped like Michigan's Upper Peninsula, a sign. This day, this afternoon, our 10,000 secrets between us, reflections mirrored perfect in the ice-cold blue of the pond outside, as close as I'll come to church, birch oil, smoke, pine tar, switch, ritual cycle of fire and sweet water, as close as I'll come to God, her body, gold, red maple leaves falling. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm really glad that you read that one, because like I said, that one is my favorite. So thank you.
The next book is all Uper poems. I'm always writing about place, and I've been working and tinkering and futzing around with this book for the last at least 6 years, and I expect to have it out here in at least to a publisher in the next 6 months or so, and those two poems will be in that book. And
awesome.
And they're very much poems from the UP.
They are. I look forward to the day that comes out. So I guess I have to wrap this up with you the same way I wrap up every single episode, and that's to ask you.
I know now.
You know now. Yeah, you know. How do you like your pasty?
So I'm going to be controversial here, and I'm going to say that eating a pasty with gravy is an abomination. The only way to eat a pasty is with ketchup.
Absolutely. I don't think that's that controversial. Most Youpers that I know are dyed in the wool ketchup.
There's always somebody out there that wants gravy, and you can't fix people.
I'm maybe I'm getting soft in my old age, but I really don't mind a gravy on a pasty. I like ketchup. I prefer ketchup, but I don't mind gravy. I'll
I've never met a pasty I didn't like. I,
exactly.
I prefer mine with ketchup, but I will happily snarfle one down
Right.
with gravy any day of the week. And if you're in Houghton, my personal favorite is from the Sumi restaurant in Houghton. The Copper Country is chock a block, shore to shore with great pasties, but I really love mine from the Sumi.
Awesome. Well, Matt, thank you again for coming on the podcast. This has
It
been
was
really
a
great.
real
I really
pleasure.
appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me. It was a real treat.